Welcome to the Renaissance Woodworker. I'm Shannon Rogers, and this is my shop update for March 24th, 2017. I get a lot of questions every single week from you guys, and first, I want to say thanks because it certainly makes doing this update a heck of a lot easier with so many questions to answer. But it's safe to say that probably 3/4 of those questions relate to sharpening. It's on everyone's mind. But at the same time, it's one of those topics that we tend to avoid because it is so personal. And there's also some very strong opinions on which method to use. Well, I have severely optimized and kind of minimized my sharpening process over the years. And I'm about ready to completely redo my sharpening bench. So I wanted to take a second to show you exactly how I sharpen my tools. It's very straightforward, and there's really not much to it. This is my sharpening bench. I actually built it and chronicled it on my blog years ago. And at the time, I had a lot of different sharpening things going on. I still had one foot in the power tool world and one foot in the hand tool world, and found that I needed a bunch of different stuff to keep everything going. Well, it just really wasn't the case. I had succumbed to kind of the sharpening fad, and every little thing that came along that seemed like it was a great idea, I ended up picking it up and trying it out. And over the years, that stuff has just kind of fallen away. And I'm down to really just 2 stones and leather strops. Now certainly I've got my hand crank grinding wheel over here that takes care of surgery, major surgery. If you nick a blade or if you have to completely reestablish a bevel or change a bevel, using the hand crank grinder works just fine. But honestly, it gets used very, very little. All of my tools have their primary bevel set, especially since I installed rubber flooring. I'm not really worrying about nicking blades from dropping them. Not that I drop that many blades anyway. So that's kind of there as the nuclear option when I have to hit the reset button and start over. But I don't really consider it to be part of my sharpening regimen because it so rarely gets used. For the most part, my sharpening happens right here on these 2 diamond stones. This is the DMT Magna base system. It, as the name denotes, has a magnetic base and a double-sided stone. This is fine and extra fine. I also have an extra fine diamond stone, which they say, I guess, is about equivalent to 8,000 grit. It's not really, it's a little bit coarser than that. But I find that this does just about everything I need. In fact, I find that using the extra fine surface and this ancillary stone is really all I need. Occasionally, if I have an edge that's being a little stubborn, I'll flip it over to the slightly coarser surface on the fine, but for the most part, if I'm just doing regular honing, I'm right here on the extra fine. I've got a spray bottle here that I've got Windex in it. And it's something that was recommended to me to help keep the stones a little bit cleaner, control some of the swarf over just using plain old water. And my sharpening method is entirely freehand. All of my edges have a hollow ground, so I can really register that edge. And I'll just work right on the diamond stone. And the nice thing about the diamond is it doesn't wear or groove or anything into the surface, so I can literally just go back and forth in the same line and not have to worry so much about spreading out over the whole stone. It doesn't hurt, and sometimes, depending on my mood, I'll kind of go in a circular motion. And that does allow me to cover the entire surface. But the idea is I'm working here until I can feel a burr on the back of the blade. Then I'll come over to my extra fine, feel that bevel angle again, and I'll just stick with the circular motion. That's kind of fun. You can feel that burr. I'll go ahead and wipe it off on my highest grit stone. And just in case that burr was left over from the previous stone, I'll go ahead and make a couple more circular passes again. And there's the burr again. Wipe that off. I have an oily rag and a little till under my bench that I'll then just wipe the blade down with. And it's essentially ready to go back to work. I used to put micro bevels on my blades, and I just don't do that anymore. Since I ditched honing guides altogether, I found that it was just easier to work on the primary bevel. and not have to worry about any of that extra angling up or tipping up or anything like that. There are some blades when sometimes it's being a little stubborn, and I will angle up just a little bit just to get to that burr a little bit faster, but for the most part, I find just working on the primary bevel works just as well. Now, I say this is ready to go, but technically there's one more step, and this is really, if there is a secret to my sharpening, it's this guy, the leather strop. If you've watched any of my videos in the last couple of years, you've probably seen this strop just kind of hanging out on the bench. I'll be doing some joinery work, and just off maybe the edge of the camera frame, you'll see that leather strop. This is a horse butt strop that I got at Tools for Working Wood. And to answer one of the questions I get most often with a strop, there is a rough side and a smooth side. You can put the honing compound, it's the little green crayon that's in here, you can put it really on either side, but I think it makes most sense to put it on the rough side. I use the smooth side almost like a higher grit stone here, and I don't find that there's any need to put any compound here. This goes with any leather, whether it's a horse butt strop like the one I just showed there, or a little bit thicker piece of leather. I've got this free floating leather here, and I can actually bend this into a concave or a convex shape, which works really well for things like my hollows and round planes or my carving gouges. And those tools is what really got me started working with the strop. The more difficult blades, like a compound or a complex molder like this OG, these don't work well on stones. So the idea is to use the strop and keep it super, super sharp and don't ever let it get dull. And that's really why I pretty much live and die by leather strops in my shop. I've got this horse butt one that stays on my bench most of the time. I've got this curvy one that I keep over on my sharpening station. Over on my joinery bench, I've got a stropping board that I made. And it's the same leather that came from this guy, but it's now been mounted to a piece of hard maple. I've got a little hole in the top that I can slip over a dog hole on my bench, and it kind of holds itself in place. It's kind of useful. You've seen this before in my videos. I've got a butt strop. I bought this at Woodcraft years ago. It's really thin leather that is around a wooden paddle. It's got a rounded edge. It's got a V-shaped edge, which is great for the inside of V gouges. I have this mounted over on the edge of my tool cabinet. And I did a video a while ago about stropping with the strop up in the air, so you can actually see that angle. It's a great technique, but I've also found the more I use the strop, the less I really have to worry about the angle that I'm presenting the tool to the leather. Let me show it to you in use, and you'll see what I mean. Now, the first thing with the strop is you always want to pull the blade. The minute you push, you're going to start digging into the strop. This is really a one-handed action for me with a small blade like this block plane blade. I'll set it down, feel that bevel, and just pull. Now, with this strop that I don't have secured to anything, I'll keep a hand back here to kind of hold that in place. But honestly, I'm pressing down on this leather a fair amount. It doesn't really have to be held in place. You'll see that the leather strop will start to slide just a little bit if you're not careful. And that's usually why that hand back here is just kind of holding it in place. Just be careful as you're bringing a blade toward your hand. Don't stab yourself. Now, I'm feeling that bevel, but at the same time, I'm not terribly worried about staying right on it. Because of the pliability of the leather, it will kind of squeeze around that edge and it will reach all the way down to that point. I'll take maybe 10 passes here. I'll flip it over to the smooth side. I'll take a couple more passes. Again, I treat this as like just a higher grit stone, if you will. Now, I'll come in and I can pull off the burr. And that's one of the reasons I love this particular strop and I love not putting any compound on it, is if you look close, there's my burr. You can see that fine line right there that just pulled off the burr, and I know that this tool is sharp now. And the real beauty of this is a totally dry sharpening method. So I could be working literally right here and just come right over, use a chisel, strop it, and come right back. And that's one of the reasons that I have this strop over my joinery bench. I'll keep it handy when I'm doing dovetailing. as I'm chopping out baselines with a chisel and the end grain starts to crumble, I just come over, strop, and go right back to work. It takes only seconds to get your blade ready to go. And I don't have to pull out any water, I don't have to soak any stones, I don't have to do any of that junk to go right back to work. And that's the beauty of the strop, and one of the reasons that it is essentially the cornerstone of all of my sharpening now. And when I say cornerstone, I'm serious. I will strop my tools for months on end before ever going back to the stone. But you start Googling and searching around internet forums for strop, and you'll find the dreaded term dubbing that comes up. Dubbing is the slight rounding over of the blade. I talked about it before, where you don't necessarily have to have that angle exactly right, because the leather is pliable enough that it can kind of squeeze up and come around the blade and squeeze around the blade and get to all the nooks and crannies, if you will. Well, at the same time, that is essentially creating tiny, tiny, tiny micro bevels that will steepen and steepen and steepen to the point where you get this rounded edge on it. That's what kept me away from stropping for years. I thought, oh, I don't want to ruin my blade, then I'll have to go do a bunch of grinding. Empirically, I don't see it. I have been stropping religiously for several years now, and I have yet to get to a point where I have to go back and reset a bevel because it's been dubbed so dramatically. And I think the key is, this is so fine. This is not heavy removal of steel. If you're trying to strop a tool that has already started to go dull, you're not going to get good results. You're stropping when your tool is still sharp. This is that extra little measure to take it from sharp to holy crap, I cut myself looking at it sharp. So there are a variety of strops that I'm using, and I do think that the harder the leather you have, like this horse butt, the less chance you're going to have for dubbing. So the one caveat I'll say is, if I'm doing my chisels, especially if I'm doing like narrow chisels like this 3/16, I will only strop on this horse butt leather because it's extremely hard, it's very, very thin. This works really well, and even though it's on a maple, hard maple board, there is a little bit more flex because the leather is thicker. So I won't strop a narrow blade like this on this particular strop. But my 1-inch chisel, I have no problem with that. It's very firm. I can strop all day long with this wider blade, and there's not going to be any appreciable dubbing. So I would love to hear from anybody who has had a bad experience with dubbing. But at the same time, let's just say that you do dub and you do round over that chisel. I go back to my stones and fix that, or if necessary, go to my grinder and fix that. And if it turns out that every couple of years it gets dubbed to the point where I've got to regrind it, oh damn, every couple of years I have to regrind an edge. It's probably a good practice anyway to regrind, reset the primary bevel, every 6 months to a year anyway. So don't be afraid of these strops. And don't think that you have to have premium horse butt leather. Although this is my favorite strop, I will say that, but it's really not that expensive. The little crayon here that I bought with it, this is after a year of use. This thing will last me my entire life. So when it comes to cheap sharpening, you can't beat the strop. But at the same time, you can't rely on the strop to be your sharpener. It needs to be purely honing. And for that matter, last step in honing. And that's why I have those diamond stones over there. Which brings me back to my sharpening bench. As you can see, I've got a pretty big sharpening bench here, and it's off camera, but I've got cabinets and drawers down underneath it that had previously held all kinds of sharpening paraphernalia. Right now, this is nothing but camera gear. Everything else is really empty. So I'm going to completely redesign this, mount it to the wall, and go with a much smaller footprint. It doesn't need to be this deep. It's only going to be about 12 inches deep. And that's really the beauty of the method that I use now. It is so simplistic that I can sharpen, my mortise chisels, I can sharpen skewed irons, I can sharpen complex, weird looking irons just by using this simple setup. There's no reason to have a bunch of additional stuff and a bunch of different jigs. And believe me, I've got it. I've got a drawer over here that is full of sharpening paraphernalia that just doesn't get used anymore. And it's really kind of disgraceful. The only other thing that I really need on my sharpening bench, I've got this little vise out here. That's what I use when I'm sharpening card scrapers. I want to clamp it in there to roll the burr or to file the edge. I've also got a saw sharpening vise back here that I'm just going to make removable and I can mount when I need it. Because frankly, I've got a lot of saws, but frankly, I don't have to sharpen them that often. We're talking maybe once a month, once every couple of months. Some of my saws that don't get used as much as others, they may only get sharpened once a year. So this is something that can be brought to bear and mounted when I want to use it. The key to the sharpening bench is having it kind of available on demand all the time. Just as I said, the horse butt strop right there on my workbench is so beneficial. There are times when I do need to kind of take a little bit more off and refresh that edge a little bit more. Having this stuff set up all the time, not having to mess with honing guides and just come in, fix the edge and get back to work is really, really beneficial. I don't want to have to pull anything out of drawers, set anything up, or in my case, I don't really want to mess with a honing guide. I don't have a problem with a honing guide. If you use a honing guide, that's great. There's some fantastic ones out there that are really quick and super easy to set up. And if that's the way you want to do it, no big deal. But I don't want to try to convince anybody to sharpen anything in a particular way. I have moved away from ceramic and water stones to diamond stones for many reasons. I really, really like them. And now we're several years on into this experiment. I'm not going back. I'm going to stick with my diamond stones. If you want to use water stones, that's awesome. The key, however, is to make it as simple as possible, because the more you sharpen, the less you're going to have to sharpen. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.